Yeah, it's been a really great workshop, and with so many different exciting papers. So it's completely beyond my wildest expectations, actually, especially in these difficult Corona times. And it's really difficult to start with specific questions. So I think in order to bring together so many different contributions, one should go to a meta level and speak about gradients of gradients. So I just was thinking maybe try to provocatively and try to formulate some questions that are maybe too philosophical questions. Maybe they're sometimes too specific, and in order to just get this discussion going. And so we all will be very happy, and I think Savi and Alex also have their questions to ask. But maybe we can start there. So I was thinking about these gradients, and we can actually put even this walls-like categorical labels into gradients because, but minimal gradients. And so there's, I think, the continuum of gradients from these categorical labels where there's have minimum, and this maximally gradient study would be where we would just focus on what are the choice for every individual language user in every specific speech situation, and we could get these probabilities. So it would be extremely precise, very fine-grained, and then we could compute all these gradient indices very, very precisely. But so there's of course a trade-off everywhere. So if we use just categorical labels and more coarse-grained data, then that would be probably, the good thing is that that's practically feasible, especially if you have thousands of languages like Matthew Dreyer. So if he started doing gradient approach, that wouldn't be really, he would be never ready with walls. And but then the bad thing is that not so good that of course we have this data reduction, and with the focus on binomial, these binary distinctions and binomial topological distributions that were already mentioned. That was from idea from Bernard Berkeley's work. And then we'll also rely on secondary sources like someone's grammar. We don't know if this is really a reliable source, because of course grammars differ in quality somewhat. But on the other hand, if we go very into data, into corpora, into experiments, then that would be descriptively really adequate and or precise. But we all know that it's extremely time consuming. We've seen some very fine studies here with the prosody, with information structure, when one has really focused on each context, and of course they could also limit in scope the sample of languages there and other things. And so, what is the optimal degree of gradients? So, how gradient do you think we should be, or you should be, for a specific research question? What are the factors that you might take into account? So any thoughts about that, or any advantages and disadvantages of different gradients levels? So what do you think?
I'll throw this to our panelists and attendees. So again, attendees, you can raise hand. Yeah, go ahead, Luigi.
Yeah. Just one point to your nice, graph from minimal gradients to maximal gradients, which is a noise. We have to deal with a lot of noise when working with automatically annotated corpus corpora, just as we and you did for our studies. So I guess there is we came out with a filter solution, filtering data with for a universal pulse of speech, or for a list of lemmas, or list of types. But I guess that noise is a really big issue in dealing with token-based typology. Yeah, just this point.
Maybe also
quick to say about that too, which is I think for me, the thing that started me doing this research was seeing noise in the languages that I was working on that were described as like, Malayalam was described as rigidly verb final in lots of cases and things like that. And I know that a lot of people who have come to this from their own particular languages, that's what it's like the sort of misdescription has motivated me anyway. I know it's motivated some other people too. And that's not necessarily like thing with walls, but that's just something that we see. So I'm thinking about like what types of noise or what types of heterogeneity is like actually harmful or masking things, versus what types of noise is just, it's okay, we can deal with it and still get the generalizations that we're interested in or the relationships. And I guess that's more of a question. I don't know if I have much more to say about that, but I really like the way you said that, Natalia and Luigi.
I mean, noise can hide some differences, especially between languages, because there are very good parser, for instance, parser for European languages, and very bad parsers, for instance, parser for minority languages or less spoken European languages. So I guess that noise can be really harmful in cross-linguistic investigations. What do you think, Alex? You too worked with automatic tools, with automatic annotation.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. Like, so one of the more sort of, I guess, points of frustration as I've been working on the project has been, right, that the parser for Japanese especially just has much more trouble with spoken data than the parser for Russian, because as I was saying, there's many more, I guess, differences, and like some of those differences are things that are specifically things that give the parser more trouble. Like, in Russian, you can't just leave off the case ending of a word, but in Japanese, you can drop the particle. And in speech, you see sentences with like multiple arguments where just every particle is gone. And the parser is like, I don't know what to do with this. They're just adjuncts or whatever. And so, so it made it such that some of the more fine-grained data that I had really been hoping to be able to get out of the project, I currently cannot look at, right? So for example, looking at non-canonical word orders was one goal, and then I had to end up basically going through by hand to look at that stuff because the parser isn't good enough to like tell me the argument structure, say. Yeah, so it's definitely an issue.
Other thoughts from here, we have someone's hand is raised. Okay, yes, I'm unmuted you. Welcome.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
So my name is Hanna and I'm working on a small indigenous language called Lule Sami, spoken in northern Norway and Sweden. And I just thought about this issue of, well, in a way, how categorical we should be when describing word order. And I think, especially when working on smaller indigenous endangered languages, I think it's quite important not to be too categorical, because that can influence prescriptivism, contributive prescriptivism a lot. For instance, Lule Sami is generally described as an OV language and as a postpositional language, and that's what I work on in particular, the order of apposition and noun. Which is, the opposite of its contact languages, Norwegian and Swedish. And so we do see that, like I said, normally Lule Sami is then sort of quite categorically said to be OV and postpositional. And that's sort of seen as prescriptively right. And that must have been sort of the traditional way, and any other word order is then seen to be, like, a lot of people seem to be influenced from Norwegian and Swedish and thus viewed negatively. Whereas actually it seems that it's been much more typical of Lule Sami that it has a more variable word order, that information structure influences word order, so that in a lot of different contexts you can get VO instead of OV, you can get preposition rather than the postposition, and so on. And so for instance, when I talk to people here about my research project, a lot of them say, oh, but you only get a prepositional word order, that's just bad Lule Sami. That's, just due to influence. But that doesn't seem to be the case. It seems across the Sami languages that this sort of variability is a very old feature. But then sort of this sort of prescriptivism due to these very categorical statements is actually, in that sense, making Lula Sami in some sort of way a bit more similar to Norwegian, in that is, you know, well, people think that it should have a more rigid word order in the same way as Norwegian and Swedish do. And, you know, that doesn't, and, you know, younger speakers tend to, well, impressionistically at least, show less variable, less flexible word order than older speakers. One of my oldest, most proficient speakers is the one who has the most word order flexibility, which I guess, and that can both be due to prescriptivism, and now it's in a sort of revitalization stage where a lot of people have sort of, well, the parents might not have grown up with the language, but have taken it back, have tried to teach it to the children, and they're being taught it in school and so on, many kids. And so obviously simplifying can help, sort of helps in that sort of context, of course, because the full picture gets too complicated. But when you make those sort of very categorical statements, and that, you know, can lead to sort of prescriptive attitudes in that language teaching and so on, which can lead to less flexibility. And of course, it might also be like what Yusavitri was talking about in your talk yesterday, that those that have less exposure to Lula Sami, of course, also, and more to Norwegian or Swedish, might also show less word order flexibility. But yeah, anyway, so I think obviously when you do big typological comparisons, you can't be that fine-grained, but I think when we, you know, work with communities, it's quite important not to be too categorical, and especially smaller, more marginalized language groups, groups of speakers. I think that, you know, we have to be very mindful of not contributing to a sort of harmful prescriptivism. Sorry, that was very long, but yeah.
No, I think it's, thank you so much for this very important point. And I think it kind of reminds me of these binary gender distinctions as well, that are also imposed in order to make life kind of simpler for some. Yeah, but yeah,
it's true.
Don't be the reality. Yes.
I'd love to talk with you about this more. This is a big prong of my research, actually, because a lot of the contexts I work in are cases where languages are under pressure for different reasons. And I've seen this type of negative ideology all over the place. And so I agree. I think that's really important to think about how, you know, saying that this is categorically how this language works or doesn't, it can be a really harmful ideology that we're putting on the language. And there are examples from, you know, fieldwork type situations that people have talked about where they went in not expecting variability or variation, and then they didn't get it because they didn't look for it, and later they found out that, you know, that was an issue. So anyway, there's a lot to be said about that. Thank you for that comment. It's like very important to me. And I think similarly thinking about, you know, what types of diachronic changes we see. So like our languages, more rigid languages, people sometimes talk about them as being more like mature or something that happens over time. And we have to, I think, be really careful when we're thinking about how we describe changes in flexibility as well. Yeah. Okay, more hands are up. Okay, Eva, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe not surprisingly, I'd like to make a case for the more fine-grained type of analysis, and I can totally see the drawbacks of it. It is a lot of work. But if we start moving towards sort of explanations for particular orders, then I think it is important to keep in mind the speakers and signers who actually do the processing and what kind of information they have available. And they have the sort of super segmental information available. So it's, yeah, it is very plausible that sort of morphological information helps to counteract the absence of direct contiguity or sort of rigid word order. But similarly, predictability of association of certain semantic roles with certain information structure roles, for example, would do a similar trick. So if you have a topic constituent and it's prosodically marked as a topic constituent, then you can have a fairly long stretch of material, and you will probably be able to predict that that topic is going to be an agent in the end. But also conversely, working with spoken language, you actually find that the more spontaneous the language gets, the shorter everything gets anyway. So worrying a lot about dependency length might not apply so much if you're talking about actual spontaneous interactions where people have a lot of common ground. Sorry, that wasn't, I'm thinking aloud. I don't have any answers, just sort of questions.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I actually was thinking about you when I wrote that. Very time consuming and very, but also very informative about your wonderful case study that you presented. Yes, so it means more gradient also means very multifactorial and taking all possible cues that, yeah, I think it will be really, we have a lot of work ahead in putting all this together, I guess.
Mark also has his hand up. Mark, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, does it sound work properly, just to be sure? Yeah, right. So it's just also mentioned to follow up the noise thing. So another noise that I guess does happen sometimes is individual variation. So for example, you know, speakers of a language don't all behave in a perfect uniform way usually. So at the lab here, we're looking at this for phonetics, and there it's typically, it's quite obvious, right? We don't pronounce sounds the same way. And I think it kind of, as you did in the acceptability judgment test, you probably see that too. You always have some people that behave kind of differently. And I guess that's also one thing that could be interesting to look at from your lab, from the perspective of your lab. So how, exactly what you presented actually at the beginning. So how does it vary across speakers? Do we have, but to look at, let's say, the variation you get usually across speaker, I think that could be quite interesting too. So do we find where are how strong, how to say, how flexible are the people in the same population? So let's say if you take, you know, monolingual English speakers, and how flexible are they in this order, and what makes some people variate more than others? That maybe could be interesting to look at.
Yes, I do have some data, and Hannah kind of goes with what you were saying too. So we see really interesting, it depends on the social context and how much people are aware of what the constituent order is. And you see sometimes if that order is marked in some way, people will be less flexible because they're, you know, going towards some, well, there's a lot of different types of explanations, and it's probably multifactorial, as we're saying. But I do think that starting with individual differences, I've been really inspired by a lot of work that Eva Dabrowska has been doing on things like this. I think that that's the way to move forward in looking at this, at least from an experimental standpoint. Yes, I completely agree. I think that, you know, we can see emergent patterns and variation that is variance in variation, I guess, which I think is important for us to understand. Yeah. So hopefully more details about that coming soon. We're still working. We have some big, large scale stuff, actually, I should have said. The large scale, like learner acceptabilities actually right now that we're working on, like 200 and some participants. So I think we're gonna see some cool things coming out of that fine-grained analysis.
Just to follow up quickly on that, so what we're doing with sound could probably also apply to word order. So for example, if you have a community of speakers and a new word order emerges, how likely it is to survive, and how does it affect, let's say, the population. So probably for that, it's better to play with, you know, artificial languages, the Edinburgh style, where you ask people to learn a new language and then you add variation in it and see how likely it is to survive. Or what we do so far is we use networks simulation to see if you introduce a small population that has a divergent, let's say, word order or sound, or way of producing sounds, does this sound survive or does it get annihilated by the entire population? And usually it survives. So yeah, probably the same with word order, I guess.
I actually have a artificial language study prep for that. I just, if anyone wants to do that, I have it designed. I just don't have the time. So I completely agree. I think this is, yeah, I think this is an interesting way to look at this. And, you know, we can also see what happens in real life and try to model that as well as we can. So I have something that would maybe replicate what we see with Malayalam English contact in the lab. So if anyone wants to do that, I have, anyway, it's ready to go. Other questions or thoughts?
Well, I just wanted to say, maybe since we don't have any hands up, like, just I'm glad that modeling came up, because that's like something I'm also interested in looking at, like agent-based models, say, of how language change spreads in different domains. So like word order would be an example of that. And like, yeah, I mean, on the question of like how much gradients is good, I think like understanding those fine-grained patterns would be important. Probably, I mean, I don't have that much experience with agent-based modeling, but to like say seeding models like that, you know, like having an accurate idea of what like the distribution of different like rates of flexibility or something in a population are would be like a really interesting thing to play around with and see how that affects how change spreads through the community. Yeah, just food for thought, I guess.
Other hand. So I don't know. I'm curious to ask you, because Mark brought up sound change. That is what inspired me to look at that, like look at gradients in constituent order, is because, you know, we can think about. So I sometimes use this example when I present, which is we have voiced and voiceless stops, right? And that's like an idea that we have, and that's helpful, and it gives us a lot of information. But actually what's going on is voice onset time, right? Which is something that is a gradient measure. It's continuous. And so once we have that notion, we can understand more about how causal relationships work, and, you know, what influences different dynamics. But it doesn't mean that we need to necessarily abandon voiced versus voiceless stops. It's just that can't tell us everything about what's going on. So I think that, anyway, I always joke that I wish I were a phonetician, because I think that, but anyway, I'm just curious, Natalia, how you started thinking about this token-based typology, because I don't think I've asked you about that.
Well, I'm actually, I have this variationist background. So for me, it's a natural way of looking at things. I don't understand how you can just put one label. It just, for me, was really, really difficult when you look at start with the data. So it's data driven, then you see all this immediately. And so for me, it was kind of a big surprise when I started doing typology, I guess. But though I understand, so these practical reasons for that. And but yes, yeah, it's so I work usually with multivariate models and very fine-grained, yes, these corpus models. So which variant people will use in each situation, and I guess so we have so maybe people interested in gradients are like ultimately will go to variation linguistics. There will be a merge. So with all these interesting sociolinguistic factors playing a role, so I guess that's probably where we are going now, and where I come from. Maybe we can ask people if they're interested in publication, post-conference, post-workshop publications. I don't know, because usually people are curious about this, so they ask this question. I haven't heard from anyone actually there, but I don't know. Maybe you just can email us, or you can say tell us what you think now, or email us later if you think that it would be a good idea.
Mark says yes, that it's a good idea.
Or we can have a vote with these hands.
Right, yes, right. Maybe a poll or something. Luigi says yes. I do think one thing I want to, maybe I have said it a lot, but I want to stress it even more, is that we, you know, a lot of us are coming to this from different angles, and we're sort of, it seems like we're converging on a similar idea, which I think is really exciting and important to state. So that makes me excited to think about where all of these research is going. All right, Mark has his hand up again. Come on in, Mark.
Yeah, so just a practical suggestion. If we go for proceedings, special issue over book volume. Because the second one usually, in my personal opinion, experience, and what I see is happening, takes much longer than a special issue.
Yes, Natalia and I were some of you might have overheard, we were talking about that during the break a little bit, and that is also what we were leaning towards. Thank you. Okay, well, I mean, my questions are endless, but our time is limited. So perhaps we should start wrapping up, unless anyone has anything else to say or ask. We still do have some time. I just didn't want to keep saying all of the different questions I have. Okay, so hopefully we can all be in discussion with each other as we move forward, like Natalia said, also about publication, or as we're developing these projects into different papers or things like that. And oh wait, is there another hand up, or is that still Mark? Okay, I don't see. Anyway, not sure. So we will wrap up here, and I will, like I said, everything is recorded. So we will have the recordings available. I'm going to try to cut them into pieces so that everyone can have just one recording of your own talk. So you can see that it's not 1 4-hour or longer video. So that might take a little bit longer. But that's what's coming next. So then also you can spread the word for people for whom it was too early, or people who weren't able to make it as well.
And I also wanted to use this opportunity to thank Savi, who has been an amazing organizer and full of ideas. And actually, it was your idea that we should kind of bridge this gap between experimental and corpus-based studies. And so thank you so much. You've done an amazing work of fantastic quality, and so everything was so smooth thanks to you.
Thank you, Natalia. Yeah, thank you. It didn't feel smooth, but thanks so much, everybody. I was really honored to get to see everyone's talks and very excited to see everything.
Yeah, and thanks to all our participants. We'll hope we'll see each other soon.
Yes, maybe in person. Okay. All right, thank you all.
The organizers.